Tortuga was alive and kicking as ever when the duo arrived that evening. Every sailor who'd ever made port at the infamous pirate haven knew that sundown was when it truly came awake, and the vulgar festivities for that night were in full swing by the time Pintel and Ragetti laid eyes on it. The only part of the harbor that wasn't draped in wallowing drunkards or cackling wenches was the air itself, which was thick with smoke and the sounds of any and all chaos. It was so chaotic that no one on the docks even seemed to notice the two men with a dog who came rowing ashore in a longboat nearly bursting with bottles of rum. Nor did anyone hassle them when those same two men proceeded to unload their cargo and haul it into town in a borrowed handcart. The pair stopped at the first tavern they happened across, the Rusty Cutlass. A steady enough crowd seemed to be trickling in and out of it, so they quickly set themselves up next to its front entrance, but out of sight of any of its windows. Pintel then left Ragetti and the dog to watch the cart while he ventured into the establishment himself. In his early pirating days, the inside of a place like this might have sent him running straight back to the Navy. After all the ships he'd destroyed and ports he'd massacred under Captain Barbossa, however, a tipsy tavern brawl was almost charmingly quaint to Pintel. He waded through that mob of rowdy patrons like a shark through the water and went right up to the bar. The bartender looked as friendly as a syphilitic eel.
"What'll it be?"
Pintel hesitated. How many years had it been since he'd spoken to anyone about buying a drink?
"How much for a pint, mate?"
he asked. The bartender poured it sloppily from a nearby keg and slammed the tankard down in front of him.
"6 pence."
Pintel wrinkled his brow.
6 pence? I don't have that."
The other man sneered.
"Then you ain't got no business here, literally."
"Not yet, you human codpiece," Pintel replied in his head. He said nothing, knowing better than to test someone who served pirates for a living. Instead, he gave a conceding nod and retreated back through the crowd towards the exit. By the time he reached it, he had 9 empty tankards and a wooden bench stuffed under his arms.
"Rum for sale, 3 pence a pint! Rum for sale, 3 pence a pint! Finely aged and straight from the rum runners! Get it while it lasts!"
Was it crooked? Yes. Was it working? Like a charm. Pintel had placed the stolen bench on top of 2 apple barrels as a makeshift bar in front of their cart. He was the one drawing in the buyers, and Ragetti was pouring the drinks and taking their money. Every pence of those earnings went straight into a pickle jar behind him that also contained the prison keys from Port Royal. That was to ensure that Poochie guarded the jar tooth and nail. There was a need to guard it. The stream of would-be customers that had been trickling into the Rusty Cutlass an hour ago was now almost entirely flowing towards their little cart instead, and most of the people who still entered the tavern came back out shortly afterward with company to try the cheaper alternative. There was such a lively crowd pressed in around the 2 hucksters that Pintel couldn't even see across the street anymore.
"Ladies, gents, this is the cheapest rum you'll find in all of Tortuga,"
he went on with his pitch.
"You gotta get it now. Supplies is running out as we speaks."
"We're down to the last bottle," Ragetti murmured.
"Step right up before it's too late, mates."
A fellow with long dreadlocks wriggled to the front of the crowd and slapped 3 pence coins onto the bench. Ragetti grabbed them and poured him a pint. A pretty, red-haired wench stepped up next and produced a shilling from her corset with what looked like a flirtatious smile. Ragetti didn't so much as bat an eye at her in return, and before she even said how many pints she wanted, he horrified Pintel by pulling 9 pence from the jar and giving her change. It turned out to be the right move. There was just enough rum left to fill 1 more tankard. Pintel groaned theatrically as the last drops dribbled out of the bottle. Then he threw his arms up.
"All right, that's it, folks. We's officially plumb out of stock."
The nearest customers groaned too, and the wench slipped away with her pint like she'd just been given the Holy Grail. That was when a bearded man in a wide-brimmed hat staggered up to the bench.
"Give me one, laddie,"
he slurred as he fumbled with his coins. Ragetti gave Pintel a cornered look. Pintel frowned at the bearded man.
"Mate, I just said we's out. There's none left to gives you."
3 pence a pint. I wants one."
"Then you'll have to wait till the next time we sellin' round here."
That wasn't the response the bearded man wanted. The delirious grin fell from his face after a beat. Then he bared his teeth and knocked their bench out of his way with a clatter. Pintel instinctively shrank back. Ragetti stepped in front of him and stood toe-to-toe with the drunk. Other unhappy mutters were starting to rise from the crowd by then.
All right, look, mate.
Ragetti tried to reason with the bearded man.
They sellin' pints for 6p in this tavern right behind us. We'll spot you 3p. No trouble then, eh?
His listener answered him with a fist to the face.
Rags!
Pintel squeaked. Ragetti fell to the ground on his rear and sat there, stiff and shaky as a loose board. His blue eye was bulging with fright, but not because of the bearded man. He was seeing something else now, something in the deepest and darkest crevice of his mind. Pintel knew that because he was seeing it too. The memory came back in flashes, like blows in a fight. He saw all those red-coated figures hunched over, saw the moonlight glinting on their bayonets each time they jammed the butts of their muskets down, heard the wails of pain at their feet from every strike. Pintel shook it all from his head and lunged in front of Ragetti. It wasn't until he heard the crowd gasp that he realized he'd drawn his sword. The bearded drunk growled. The customers behind him moved in with their own weapons suddenly in hand. Pintel gulped.
Rags.
He saw one of his friend's legs trembling in the corner of his eye, still sprawled on the ground. Poochie began barking anxiously.
Rags, grab the jaw. We gotta go.
The crowd edged closer in a rum-fueled, beastly rage.
Ragetti!
The first attacker charged. Pintel knocked him and his sword back harmlessly with his own blade. A second opponent dove in right away, only to drop his sword and double over when the bald pirate's foot caught him in the groin. That turned him into an obstacle that tripped at least a third enemy. The bearded man who'd started this whole debacle came forward next. Pintel froze at the sight of him. Now the drunken git had a pistol in his hand. The troublemaker raised his weapon unsteadily, reaching for the trigger, until a green coconut crashed into his face. The man went down. Pintel dared to look back over his shoulder and beamed with relief at the sight of Ragetti. The skinny blonde hardly seemed up for a fight, but he was on his feet again, and gathering the money jar and their bundle of gear into his arms. Pintel hauled the wooden bench from the ground with his free hand.
Run!
Ragetti did. Poochie was a step behind him. Pintel flung the bench into the mob to topple over the first row of rioters before taking off after his cohorts. One by one, the three of them darted along the rusty cutlass's front wall, up the steps to its entrance, and into the tavern itself. They couldn't have picked a better retreat. Their rum sale had lured almost every patron out onto the street in the past hour, leaving the building nearly empty. While Pintel barricaded the front door from inside with another bench, Ragetti raced along the dining hall and past the bar. Pintel saw his friend reach into their money jar as he ran and slam down a handful of coins in front of the bartender.
Sorry about the window!
Ragetti called back.
What window?
The bartender demanded. Ragetti drew a pistol from the canvas bundle and fired straight ahead, shattering the tavern's rear window. The lanky pirate sped right up to that now empty frame and vaulted through it like a bloody Olympian. Poochie leapt onto a nearby chair and dove out after him with the same agility. Pintel cringed as he neared the window. He was no Olympian. He grabbed the same chair, climbed onto the seat, and hauled himself over the windowsill as gracefully as a walrus. By then, the bartender had recovered from the surprise and was storming up to him. Pintel stopped the other man in his tracks by pointing his own pistol at him.
Mate,
He said with exasperation.
I ain't got no business here, remember?
With that, he rolled himself out the window and landed like a sack of potatoes on the muddy cobblestone outside. Ragetti was there to help him up. Then the two of them and Poochie tore off into the night. They didn't stop until the sounds of the riot faded behind them, and they found an empty alleyway to duck into. There, they sank to the ground and slumped against the walls to catch their breath. It was then that Pintel noticed the pistol still clutched in Ragetti's hand. It was Twig's. The older peddler motioned to it with a nervous grin.
Brothers of Charity, aye?
The 12 Daggers Cantina wasn't any cheaper or quieter than the Rusty Cutlass, but it had a slightly more pleasant atmosphere. More importantly, it had an upper dining level where anyone trying to avoid attention could go to be less conspicuous. Pintel and Ragetti would have bolted up to that level like their shoes were on fire if there weren't so many people sitting and drinking on the staircase itself. 30 minutes after finding a table, Pintel was making his second trip up those stairs. He held a pint of rum in each hand, purchased from the cantina's bar with some of his recent income, and this time he had every intention of drinking one of them. As soon as he reached the upper level, he spied Poochie devouring some mystery piece of food in his hiding spot under their table. Ragetti sat at the table's far side, idly glancing over the railing to watch the band play below. 2 plates of fish and chips sat steaming in front of him.
Oi,
Pintel remarked brightly.
the servers actually come up here. I figured those lasses left you to fend for yourself on this floor.
Ragetti said nothing.
No matter.
Pintel plunked himself triumphantly into his seat and slid one of the pints across the table. His friend gave it a dour look.
You really wants to drink right now?
Don't you?
Well, if memory serves me right, the last time we involved rum in our evening activities,
Ragetti rubbed the bruise on his nose none too subtly.
I almost got me face smashed in.
The elder shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
Well, there's no better way to soften the sting than with a nip from the old bottle.
He raised his pint quickly.
Come on, we earned this one.
There was a beat of uncertainty. Then Ragetti took up his own drink. They clinked their metal tankards together in a silent toast, and both took their first swig. Pintel hummed contently. Ragetti nearly coughed up a lung.
Forgot how strong the taste was.
The younger man rasped. The stouter one withheld a laugh.
You doesn't drink it for the taste, Rags. You drinks it for the feeling.
That of all things seemed to get the other's attention. He looked at his comrade for the first time since Pintel had sat down. Then he lowered his gaze in thought. Then he spoke.
You know, I've been thinking about what we should do after this. Where we could go.
Pintel squared his jaw when he sensed what was coming. Ragetti seemed to read this response and lose some of his nerve.
Look, I knows at first we couldn't go home because we deserted the Navy, and then you said we couldn't go home because we was cursed. But we ain't no more, and it's been so long since the desertion that neither one of us looks the same as we did back then. Maybe we could finally go back?
There was a long pause. Then Pintel summoned the nerve to meet Ragetti's eye, an eye as blue as Edith's.
Kingston's too close to Port Royal, Rags.
He said softly.
We can't take that chance.
Ragetti looked away, sullen but not surprised. Pintel nudged his pal's plate closer.
Come on, eat. It'll help.
He picked up his own piece of fish then to demonstrate. No, wait, you were supposed to use utensils, weren't you? He set the food back down, then he clumsily cut a piece with his fork and knife and crammed it into his mouth. Pintel had to drop the utensils and sit back when the flavor hit him. This was something you took in for the taste, and by God did it taste like being alive again. The band's jaunty music ended at that moment. A round of whistles and cheers filled the cantina in response, only to fade as the next piece began. This one sounded much different than the last. It was slower and calmer, and the only band member playing it was a man seated at the front of that tiny stage. He plucked the first chords with methodical care from the stringed mandala in his lap, looking almost entranced by his own tune, and then, impressively enough, he began to sing. Alas, my love, you do me wrong, to cast me off discourteously, when I have loved you for so long, delighting in your company. Greensleeves was all my joy. Greensleeves was my delight. Greensleeves was my heart of gold. And who but my lady Greensleeves? It was a nice song, Pintel supposed. Nothing too special. That opinion changed in a hurry when he glanced across the table. Ragetti looked utterly enraptured by what he was hearing. That took Pintel aback for a minute. This was the thing to finally get a positive response from the lad? Why? They hadn't needed to break that curse to hear music again. Although, when was the last time they'd really heard any? Had it honestly been 10 years ago? Once the song ended, Ragetti faced Pintel with a serene, secretive smile.
Some people thinks that song were written by King Henry VIII of England about his second wife, Anne Boleyn,
he said almost bashfully.
It weren't. He's following an Italian style of music what no one in England ever heard till long after Henry VIII died.
Pintel squinted bizarrely at the youngster. He was about to inquire about this odd choice of topic and how Rags knew the first thing about it, but then he stopped himself. Rags's father had been Italian, just like this song, it seemed.
Drink your rum, lad,
Pintel urged him gently. Ragetti acknowledged his tankard with more intrigue this time. After he chugged its contents, he was glowing with wild-eyed exhilaration. Pintel cocked an eyebrow.
More?
More.